Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Love on Campus acknowledges the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, land never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the rich living traditions of storytelling and knowledge of this country. We also extend respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait and First Nations, recognising the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices. Hello, welcome to the very first Love on Campus podcast. I'm Dr. Amy Matthews and I'm here today with Kathleen Stanley.
Hello.
And Georgia Nichols.
Hello.
And we are three popular romance scholars, romance writers and mad romance readers and fans. And we're joining you today to really just talk about the romance genre and from the perspective of scholarship, reading and writing. So I thought, since it's our first episode, that today would be a good chance for you to get to know us and what we do. So we're going to just go around and let you know what our areas of research are. So we'll start with you, Kathleen.
Okay, well, I am Kathleen Stanley. Hello. I am a PhD candidate here at Flinders University. I study small town Christmas romance. That's my specialty, but I do love all popular romance studies and literary studies in general. One day I'll start writing some romance when I get some time, add it to the list. But other than that, I read romance books like they're potato chips.
Yeah, I can't keep up. I have to admit with both of you, I can't keep up with the way both of you get through romance novels. And what about you, Georgia?
Oh, goodness. All right. I'm Georgia Nichols. I am, like Kathleen, a PhD student at Flinders University. I'm in my second year, so kind of getting into the depth of it now. I'm looking at, and this is always difficult to try and discuss and how to bring it up. I never know how to, I don't know.
Oh, the elevator pitch is so hard. It's really hard to distill everything you're thinking about into two sentences.
Especially when I have to bring up porn, usually, and it's always like, what are you doing with your life? Oh, I'm doing a PhD. In what? We just met. I don't know what to... No, so I'm looking at sort of the pornification of the romance genre and how feminist movements, specifically third and fourth wave, have impacted the way that romance novels are written and how they talk about sex and intimacy and love.
So really cutting edge of the moment stuff. And also I'd like to point out to everyone that Kathleen is a literary studies scholar, so is focusing on the kind of reading and critical side of things. And Georgia is a creative writing scholar, so you're not just analysing things, you're trying to create something in this space.
Trying to write a big old novel for the first time in my life.
So we can keep tabs as we go through the episodes how that big old novel is going.
Yeah. Keep you accountable, Georgia.
You get to track her mood over the course of the book.
We'll have a word count follow.
And I'm Dr. Amy Matthews, so I'm Senior Lecturer in Creative Writing here at Flinders, and I'm a popular romance scholar, among other things, but I'm also an author and I do write in the field of romance. So I've written historical romance under the name Amy Barry and Tess Lassou, and I'm currently writing, I guess, book club / rom-coms under the name Amy T. Matthews.
Fabulous books.
She's the most credible of us all right now.
But the pod came about because the three of us were meeting over the last year or so pretty regularly to talk about romance and everyone's scholarship, and we just found that our meetings would blow out.
Yes.
Yeah, so like a 50-minute meeting might end up being 3 or 4 hours. And there are a number of times where Kathleen was like, we should be recording this.
Yeah.
So here we are. Now we'll find out whether it's worthwhile recording.
We're dragging you all along with us now.
Yeah, I have to follow our processes of
The
thought.
flies on the wall now.
So the one thing we kept getting hooked on in the last year was this question of how we define a romance novel. Because shockingly to most people outside the field, it hasn't really been well defined. So everyone has a common sense idea of what they think a romance novel is. But actually, in terms of scholarship, there are only a couple of definitions and they're quite dated now. So this podcast is really going to be discussing the whole genre of romance, but also diving into subgenres, tropes, books. We're going to read some books. We're going to look at cultural issues and definitions of romance. And we're going to circle this season, we're going to circle that foundational definition of the romance novel, which comes from, where does it come from, Kathleen?
Pamela Regis.
Pamela Regis. So if you are a scholar of romance or a student of romance, you will have stumbled across Pamela Regis's A Natural History of the Romance Novel, which was published in 2003. And yes, that's so shocking that the foundational definition wasn't advanced until 2003.
Yep. She's really the first one who put it on paper, I guess.
Yeah.
In such defined detail. I think it was republished in 2007 as well because it was very popular.
Yeah, it was, and it crops up in everything that you read.
Yeah.
So I guess we're really curious why there hasn't been more discussion of the definition. Like, a lot of people just reference it, quote it, put it forward, and yet it seems to me the definition of romance is increasingly contested in our field. And so I also want to acknowledge here that all three of us are cis white het women. So this podcast is going to be focused primarily on us talking about our scholarship and our feelings and thoughts about things. So it will be coming from a white cis het place. But one thing we have noticed among ourselves is a massive generational difference. So the three of us are different generations. So I'm tail end of Generation X.
I'm a millennial.
And I'm Gen Z.
And we have very different historical and contextual perspectives on things like love, sex, and romance.
Yeah, because you really can't separate yourself from it when you think about it. Like, I think one of the habits of literary studies to try and really just take the genre or the, writing or the book and look at it by itself. But I think you really can't separate your positionality from romance. I would say maybe from all genre, but specifically here as we're talking about romance, I think our positionality really reflects and influences how we feel about love.
And I think standpoint has become such an important point of scholarship too, to articulate your standpoint, particularly in kind of post-colonial, spaces where gender and sexuality matter.
Yes.
I think so. We've been really interested in, as our conversations unfold, how that standpoint has changed the way we read things. And so in this podcast, we're interested in romance as a mirror. So a mirror to society, but also as a fantasy space where we kind of project our cultural anxieties and where we work through cultural change. And we really are interested in tracking that from this generational perspective, because Georgia and I, I am old enough to be Georgia's mother. Like, seriously, her brother was in the same class as my son. I'm literally old enough to be her mother. So we have very different perspectives on these things. And we're really curious about how those perspectives change definitions. Like, how do we, the three of us, define romance in 2023?
Yeah. And what are those unifying opinions as well? What do we focus on, cross-generationally?
In the Venn diagram, where do our circles cross?
Yeah. That's right. And in the middle will be some kind of stable definition of romance, probably.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw over to you guys now, because I've talked a lot about that Regis definition, which has been foundational, which we're going to spend this season kind of circling. What is Pamela Regis's definition of romance?
Do you want me to take it, Georgia?
Yeah, go on. Should we do the elements first? Do you want to?
Well, actually, I was wondering if we should, before we jump into, just as a heads up for newbies to romance, Regis has 8 sort of points or steps, elements that she defines romance by. But before she defines those 8 points, she does have 2 rules, which romance writers who are joining us will be very familiar with, because it's sort of the definition that's across a lot of the writerly.
Yeah, so if you go to like Romance Writers of Australia or Romance Writers of America or like the Mills and Boon website or something.
Yeah. And I really wanted to hit this point because some of you may be completely new to romance, or some of you may be sort of think you know about romance, but the one thing we find, especially because all of us have taught undergrads romance, is that a lot of you don't know what romance even is. And so there is a really strict rule that I think we should just quickly preface, and it will come up a lot. But romance covers the courtship of two people and has a happy ending. And those are the sticky, hardcore rules that Regis lines out as well. But most of you out there who are romance writers or readers will be hopefully emphatically nodding your head along going, yes, yes, yes.
And that's probably, I have to say, one reason I think it's interesting to keep coming back to this idea of definition is because even in preparation for today, we were all Googling, top 10 romance novels, best romance novels. And it's quite shocking that I would say a lot of what comes up is not what fits the definition of a romance novel.
And like subgenres, and they were sort of outlining spicy romances, if you will, and all of us were saying, well, that's definitely not a spicy romance. Like
there's no sex in that.
The fade to black scene.
It's like, hang on, you've closed the door. What's spicy about that?
So when I was teaching recently, I had to collect all of those like general definitions that you were talking about, Kathleen, the central love story and the happy ending. And there's like a couple. There's central love, there's the courtship, and then the betrothal. I think that's more Regis.
Yeah.
And then there was central love story and happy ending. That was Romance Writers Australia and America. That was something they were looking at. And then I was looking at some Harlequin, Mills and Boon authors, and they also said central love story. And I think they said sexually gratifying or something like that as well. And then they also said a happy ending or a happy for now ending.
Okay, so what strikes me when you say gratifying, because I don't think it even has to be sex, but the core thing I would add in, so if we have courtship, so two human beings and a happy ending, the happy ending in a sort of het romance should be for the heroine.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of traditional scholarship, like a lot of literature, focused on the man's story. So this is about a happy ending that is about an emotional, loving happy ending.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think emotion is the key word, is that it's really following an emotional journey. I know some people are very plotty with their romances, but I actually am of the personal opinion that plot is secondary. If you don't have your characters, if you don't have your emotions there, I don't think you're hitting the romance properly, because that's really, we want to feel. It's all about what you're feeling.
Yeah, so that's the other thing I would have added is that the experience of reading a romance is an affective experience, is the idea that you're supposed to feel certain feelings. So there's certain, rushes of chemicals you're supposed to feel that mimic falling in love or are giving you the warm fuzzy feelings or sexual desire, and then the end feeling, that happily ever after, is about a feeling you're trying to get the reader to feel.
Yeah, because there's nothing that pisses me off more, excuse my language, but when you read a romance and you don't care. Like, I want to care. I want that endorphins. I don't care how cheesy it is. I think some people are too afraid of being a bit cheesy. I don't care. If I care enough about the characters, it can be cheesy as hell.
Let's face it, real life is actually cheesy sometimes.
Yeah. And you just want that rush at the end. You want to feel good. You want to close the book and go, yeah, that was nice. That was so much nicer than anything going on in my real life right now.
The other things too, if we're thinking about that kind of basic definition, which is, courtship, two people, happy ending, is also going back to Northrop Frye, who was a literary scholar way back when. But he was talking about romance is about an idealised world, and I think that's a really key element to romance too, is that it's about turning up the colour on things, and it's kind of hyper real. And cheesy is like another way of describing that, probably.
Yes, I would agree.
Aspirational in a way that
is
often
soft focus and a bit prettier than real.
Yeah, it's often described as unrealistic, but it's just...
Oh my God, can we come back to that after we go through the elements? I really want to talk about that criticism. So I thought,
why was there a rage that just like burst out of my chest? Did you feel it emanating off this microphone?
So I thought maybe if we go through the 8 and then we'll look at some of the criticisms, but also maybe the question about how realistic it is a really good one for our episode on endings too.
Yeah.
Because I think the endings are where romance cops a lot of flack.
Hugely. Like everyone all of a sudden is like, that's not realistic.
Even
Just
though
together.
how many weddings happen every weekend?
Right.
So how is it not realistic? It's that people want to go to the divorce bit, right?
Yeah.
They want to know that they, are a little bit unhappy.
Excuse us all for falling in love. Oh, vomit.
For being happy and healthy in our relationships.
But we will interrogate it. We will dive
Yes.
into some of that criticism and look at it from all angles. Okay, Pamela Regis's 8 Essential Elements to a Romance Novel from 2003. And I do also want to flag that she was talking about romance novels. She tracks a history from 1740 to the 1990s. So she wraps up in the 1990s, which is 30 years ago. So her definition is really concentrated on the 20th century, not now.
Yeah.
And super central to Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yes. Well, yeah, I was going to say, if we're really going to poke the bear, like she goes way back and doesn't even use a modern book when she
No,
Yeah, she
defines
doesn't.
them. No offense, Pamela Regis.
No,
but
Pamela Regis is concentrating on literature, and Pride and Prejudice is her example of excellent romance. So, yeah, we are going way back to the 19th century with this definition. So what is the first essential element?
the initial state of society.
It's probably not what people were expecting.
No.
I think most people are expecting to start with the meet cute, but we're
Yes.
starting before the meet cute with the state of society.
Yes. Which we will get into this in later weeks, because I have a lot to say about that one point already. Which I
In
can
fact, your whole thesis is really revolving around that one point.
I do have a lot when it comes to society, but I do want to flag that something Regis does say after she defines it for Pride and Prejudice and lays it all out for us, is that when she's talking about it when she hits the 90s, is that she doesn't find it as relevant anymore, which is we're going to get fired up, Kathleen, later.
Because again, that's positionality, right?
Oh,
Not
yes.
relevant to her.
Yes. I was like, I think there's a lot of people out there would say the state of society really affects the way they are positioned in this world. And I think that's kind of a privileged thing to say. I don't want to say that in a mean kind of way, but
No,
I
we're talking about the
is.
ideas, not the person.
Yeah,
and also,
no.
props to Pamela Regis for
Yeah.
being the first to advance the definition and publish. And this field was thin for a very long time, and we have
Absolutely.
huge admiration for every popular romance scholar that came before us.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I mean, this is the point, is when you lay a foundation, and I'm doing that in Christmas romance, is that everyone who comes after you is allowed to pull it apart. They're allowed to take what you did and build on it. And I think that's a privilege of probably being somebody who started in the beginning, because you can't possibly take into account every single little thing or things that changed. Like you said, she took it to the end of the 90s. She kind of, it was early 2000s that this was released. We're in 2023 right now when this is being recorded. There's 20 to 30 years there.
Yeah, things have evolved.
Yeah, the world moves fast.
So the state of society, what she's talking about, she says in the book, in this part of the romance novel, the society is in some way flawed and it always oppresses the hero and heroine. So thoughts on that?
Oppress feels like a strong word.
She can get quite melodramatic.
Yeah.
She can. The titles are quite melodramatic.
But when you consider that she's saying that it's not really relevant anymore,
That's a bit weird. That is a bit strange.
that, I was like,
She didn't know what the 21st century was bringing.
yeah. I was like, there's quite a few flaws, I think, I would say, still in society. I definitely don't think we've evolved quite past flawed society yet.
No, absolutely not. I find society defined a very difficult aspect of it. It's an important aspect of the romance genre, but I do find it difficult, even just from a writerly perspective at
I used
the
to,
moment.
when I first started teaching romance a long time ago now, I worked with a friend of mine who's an academic, Dr. Chelsea Avard, just shouting out to her. And we used to teach these 8 essential elements. And she said part of the problem with teaching them is that the melodrama of the titles makes you think the content is going to be bigger than it is.
Yeah.
That actually society, defining the problems in society are not as big as you think they are.
Yeah.
So, Kathleen, can you give us an example of what that might be, that oppression or?
I mean, it would be, for some people, it would just be natural, I guess. I mean, you might have a heroine that's racially marginalized, sexually marginalized, or you might have somebody who is white, het, but poor, or female.
Yeah. So if you, I mean, I think we often go to the big things like racial inequality, and sometimes it might be sexism. Like obviously these have been traditionally been het books for women, like books, about het women. But sometimes it's smaller. It's a psychological oppression, right?
Yeah.
It's a family environment, or it might be an addiction, or it might be
trauma.
a psychological issue. It's always a problem.
It could even be something as simple as, so for me, I do small town Christmas romance. There is a lot of shit tied up with the small town.
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff tied up with where you live, where you're from.
Families.
I mean, we're Australian, this country and the land we're from and where we live, there is so much culturally there that's tied up that you can't erase that. And the minute you write, even from wherever you pick, so if you pick an Australian location or you pick an American location or you pick a European one, there's a history that is embedded in your writing that you can't escape even if you want to.
So is this really about, do you think this first essential element is really about character context?
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
That you can't divorce a character from a time and place, and that any problem your character is going to be facing is a societal problem.
Yeah, and I think that is what Regis initially meant, because she was using Pride and Prejudice and using the timing and using the place where they were from and the society they were from. I think we just forget that the society we're from now is still embedded with these things, and we like to talk about the past and historical elements of this as if it's separate from what we're going through now. But everything you write now, everything you read now is a reflection that 100 years from now somebody will talk about.
Because Pride and Prejudice, I mean, these kinds of novels were originally called in the 19th century the marriage plot. Wasn't necessarily called a romance. But you're right. I mean, I have a brother-in-law, shout out to him as well, who loves to make little snide comments about in Pride and Prejudice that she only loves Darcy because she sees Pemberley. And he says she only loves him for his Pemberleys. And I always say that's the point of the book, like that actually she needs to get married.
Yeah.
And it's like Darcy is a lovely guy, right? She doesn't choose him the first time he proposes because she doesn't like him. So the Pemberleys are not worth it. But the point of the book is about the powerlessness of women and all this family with all these daughters. And so what Regis is saying is that you can't lift a woman from her context. You can't lift a heroine from her context, and her problems will be related to her context.
Yeah. I think if you even think about modern romance novels like Book Lovers, if I think about that one, a lot of that is
love
about...
that book.
Great book. Yeah, a lot of it is about her sort of navigating her career and being able to provide and create a life for herself in the context of like her family and being able to support her sister and all of that.
I also thought the opening of that book. Sorry to cut you off, Georgia.
No, that's okay.
No, I reckon you're Amy, you're going to go where I was going to go. I think.
I just love the opening of that book about being the non-Hallmark woman.
Yes, that's exactly where I was going to go.
I'm going to let you run with that because that's one of your areas. But
no, that's okay.
Brilliant opening.
Yeah, well, and it's actually been something I was thinking about all day today, weirdly enough. So it's cool that this has come up organically. But I was thinking about Book Lovers and how we think about society, like even society there, it's so intrinsic, right? Like she was a woman from the city. She was a businesswoman who self-describes as the villain of the Hallmark story,
that's
right?
I love it.
She identifies herself as the villain who is not worthy of love, who's left, who doesn't get.
Yeah, she's the woman who gets left behind when he discovers the cookie baking woman in the small town.
And she's not soft and she's not these things. She's icy and she's described with all these hard words.
That we ascribe to career women, right?
Yeah, that there's a certain type of feminism here that's part of our society, and we'll get right into the messiness of feminism, no doubt, over the next coming weeks. But there is a messiness there that defines how our society is trying to even still work out how to be a woman, how to be the right kind of woman, how to approach being a woman, and who deserves love and who doesn't. And it's, I mean, a load of crap, but it's also intrinsically all who we are and what we battle with and fight and have to navigate every day as women. And I think that it can come down to something as small as that and as unnoticeable perhaps about society. Like we can't escape it. We can't escape these things.
And the metafiction of that book too, of it's really thinking about the state of romance too, and who gets to be in this narrative, this culture narrative.
Who gets the happy ending?
Yes, we should probably hit a new point because otherwise we're going to have nothing to say on society.
This is basically how our conversations go. 5 hours later, we'll be at point 2.
It's 8 points.
So point 2 is the meeting. So Georgia, do you want to walk us through a bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's relatively self-explanatory. I think Regis says that it can sort of, I mean, all of her points can happen at any point in the novel. Sometimes romance, the heroine and the hero have met before, and then you sort of have flashbacks. You have them actually having that meet cute at the beginning. It sort of takes all kinds of form.
I'm such a sucker for a meet cute.
Me too.
Yeah, me too.
Love them.
I kind of hate flashbacks, or like when they already know each other. I'm a bit like.
Although, if you've listened to Word Docs, you know I always bang on about this. I love Sleepless in Seattle where they don't meet until the end.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Perfect example.
And then number 3 is the barrier, which I'm going to throw to Georgia as well, because I know you're thinking about this one a lot. Because Regis says the barrier drives the romance novel.
Yeah. I mean, oh God, every time I have to define it or talk about it,
I know,
it's difficult.
so hard.
Like,
This is why we're devoting a whole season to it.
Yeah.
There's a lot here, guys.
Well, she talks about internal and external barriers, I think, as well. And romance novels obviously takes on both of them. And, you know, is what's stopping them being together something that they need to mentally get over, or something that they need to actually move past? Is it?
Yeah, because I think one of the criticisms of romance is about its simplicity, and I think they often come from people who are not romance readers. And they've never tried to write one because they're so hard
difficult.
to write.
Oh my God.
Georgia literally messaged me the other day and said, whoever said writing a romance was easy has never written a romance.
Oh my God. Just like working with the barrier is so difficult, I think, in a romance novel. Like, because a lot of the time there's no real explanation as to why they can't just be together, and you really have to stress the worries that they have and the things that are keeping them from diving headfirst into a romance. And
Which is so much like real life. Like you think about every guy you've liked, if you're straight, or if you're, you know, any person you've liked. What gets in your way is you.
Yeah, it's your head, it's your inability to, you know, you feel like you don't deserve someone, you feel like you don't want to end up in an emotional, you know, connection again. It's all that sort of stuff.
I mean, humans are just, excuse my language, but totally fucked up.
Yeah.
Like you can have 2 people who are in love with each other for years and are just not brave enough to go talk to each other or tell each other that they like each other. Or you can have 2 people who are together and you know they're right for each other, but because of their addictions or illnesses or whatever's going on in their life, they just screw each other up. Their jealousy. We all have friends like that where you're watching a romance novel play out.
Oh my gosh, I have a friend right now who I won't name because she will definitely be listening. But
every friend you have right now is thinking, is it me?
Yeah, she's going to know. She's a beautiful person, but she's recently divorced, and we're the same age, so millennial age, and she's having to step back into that dating game, and we've been talking this week about a guy she met last week, and she says it just feels like you play all these games that she'd forgotten about because she'd been married and she'd been in a long-term relationship, and all these games she has to make, and she sort of said all these things, not just the barriers that are up, the barriers she puts in up herself.
Yeah.
And we've been talking them down. I'm not going to go into detail. It's not fair to her, but these barriers that she has that she puts in the way to protect herself. And it's instinctual, and
also we're all insecure.
Yeah, and we've been tracking it all the way back to her childhood because armchair therapist me over here loves to get into it. But you know, you can track these things all the way back when in real life. So why? I think for me, the bravest writers are not only romance writers, but the bravest romance writers are willing to take their traumas and understand them all the way back and walk their characters through them. And that's a hard thing to do and sit through for 80,000
and make it fun.
words.
And make it a fun read too, even a big emotional read, to make it kind of gripping.
You have to be so brave to write a romance, to be willing to really go into somebody's darkest, deepest fears and give them hope. I think that is such a brave thing. Like, I don't understand how people can badmouth romance and romance writers, because they are the bravest people. Like, you have to be so brave, which is why, of course, they're women. Hopefully all our women listeners are all clapping their hands to that.
Yeah, some biological determinism going on.
Sorry, guys. Write more romances and you'll understand what I mean. But I genuinely think that, there's a braveness and a vulnerability that you have to be as a writer to really go to that place. I have a lot of thoughts in the barrier. I'm going to save them. Listen,
Don't
stay on board, guys. I will get into it later. I have a lot of thoughts.
Well, I thought what was interesting with Regis says that romance, and I think this is about the barrier and about how it's resolved. Romance is about the difficulty and importance of communication.
Yeah.
And I really feel like romance novels is about, they're really about how you get through miscommunication, misunderstanding and insecurity.
Yeah.
The human condition.
Your ability to talk about the things that have happened to you and then meld that with someone else and be able to learn from them and then develop new relationships. And
because there's three major braveries about falling in love and being in a relationship. One is getting naked, right? Like actually having sex with someone it actually requires a lot of bravery to go, I'm going to take all my clothes off and be completely exposed and do these things where I feel vaguely ridiculous sometimes, and you might laugh at me or you might be totally turned off by me. So that's pretty brave.
Yeah.
The second one is like emotional nakedness.
Yep.
Yes.
Like to actually let someone see your hot mess and decide whether they think you're worth being with or not.
Completely. Yeah.
And the third one's trust.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically what the romance barrier is can you trust someone sexually? Can you trust someone with your emotions? And then can you trust them for the long term with those things?
Yeah. And I think the best written romances don't just have them for I'm going to get a bit gendery here for the heroine.
Let's just put out a proviso that Kathleen will often get gendery. Just go with it. She believes in all the right things. You are not a biological determinist, but now and then, for the sake of the podcast, you will fall into that language.
Yeah, and it's hard because romance is dominated by het writing. And so a lot of our definitions and a lot of when we talk about stuff has been taken from that place. But I am prefacing it that I don't mean it that specific way, but it is a female-dominated space. So.
And we will, when we finish these 8 essential elements, if we get through the next 5 hours, I will pose some questions that will show you where we're coming from with these.
Yeah. So I just want to say that maybe I'll reword that for both protagonists. In my thesis, I call them protagonist 1 and protagonist 2 to be a little bit more fair. But traditionally, we have often called it it's the female's journey and the female's barriers that are the most important. But I think the best written romances give both protagonists these barriers and really go into them. And I've noticed, and I apologize if this sounds a bit harsh, but sometimes lazy romance writers will just do it for their main character.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
That's where I think if you're thinking, why is my romance not working? It's because you haven't given both your characters the same depth. I'm sorry, that's it for me.
And personally, I love it when every single character has it, even all the big characters.
Yeah,
that's when something really pops.
I'm sorry, everyone has problems.
So the next one, number 4, is attraction, which seems pretty self-explanatory for a romance novel.
Yeah. They're into each other. They would like to see each other's bodies.
It's the first naked point.
So Regis says attraction can be based on a combination of sexual chemistry, friendship, shared goals or feelings, society's expectations, and economic issues. Because, of course, there are romances where sex is not foregrounded. And then if we go back to like Jane Austen era, there were marriages that were based on economic issues and love came later. And the next one is number 5 is the declaration. So how would you describe the declaration? This one can get a bit confusing because it can get confused with the recognition.
I suppose
I think actually maybe this is a good time to premise that these points, we're listing them, but they don't occur necessarily in a romance in this order.
No, not necessarily. They get mixed up and sometimes each one can occur a couple of times.
And if you think about Pride and Prejudice, using Regis's example, there are multiple declarations of love throughout where both Lizzie and Mr. Darcy go back and forward with declaring it and denying each other and declaring it and denying each other until at the end they finally are on the same page.
So this is the moment. So the first declaration in the book would be the moment where one character is brave enough to say, hey, I like you.
Yeah.
And it always takes one. And then, like you said, like in Pride and Prejudice, Darcy proposes the first time and she says, hell no.
She's outraged. How offensive.
So it's just that first moment of bravery. The next one is the point of ritual death. And this is where we used to talk about how melodramatic the titles are, because I think the point of ritual death also makes things seem like they're harder to understand than they really are.
It's essentially just the section where each character just doesn't see a way that they can be with each other.
And for the reader too.
Yeah, for the reader, yeah.
I think it's that moment where all is lost. You
Yeah.
think, how can they possibly fix this
Where
shit?
that's the end of what's going to happen and you think that there's just no working through it. There's no changing anything.
So a lot of romance writers will refer to this as the black moment.
I don't love that name either.
Yeah.
But I get it. It's the bleak moment.
Yeah,
for me.
let's call it the bleak moment. We
like
can
that.
The
name
bleak
that.
moment. I do prefer that because I also don't think that mainly it's. Well, I think Regis says it's about both. There's like both characters and their things coming together.
This is
That's
where
the
at
time.
3 a.m. you can't stop reading because you're like, I cannot work
Yeah.
out how they're going to resolve this book,
Yeah.
but I can see there are only 3 chapters left.
And where you're possibly the angriest at the two of them or one of them. You're like, why didn't you just freaking say it? Or
Yeah.
why didn't you just get over yourself? Like,
Yeah.
you're so mad at them in that
Exactly.
moment. You're like, come on.
And so many times it does happen really close to the end, and you're like, how on earth are you going to figure this out in like
2 pages.
like what? Yeah. Good.
And so what follows the point of ritual death, or sometimes doesn't follow it, is somewhere else, is the recognition of means to overcome.
Yeah, which is also kind of self-explanatory. The
Their
note-
ability to get over
the
those
light
things.
bulb.
And the key to this one, I think, it's in that recognition idea, is that it's a self-driven moment. Like it's a moment of self-recognition. Like, here's how I'm screwing this up. Here's what I've done to make sure this doesn't work. Here's my demons.
I keep coming back to wanting to use like my own ideas for my own novel and
You don't want to give away your ideas.
I know. I'm like, I don't want to do that. But
Once you've released the book, we can read your book and go through it, and you can explain it.
Yes.
It
then.
could be one of our book club books.
yeah, hopefully
definitely.
it does get that release. But who knows? But yeah.
And then we have the final, the happy ending, which again, this is dating Regis, is called the betrothal.
And she has
So beyond
self-corrected this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will give Regis absolute credit for immediately going, hang on a second, that was a little bit too much.
Yeah. I mean, in the 19th century novel, yes,
Yeah.
the marriage
Yeah.
plot must end
Yeah.
with the marriage.
Well, I think in sort of contemporary or like modern novels, the way that I explain the difference in endings nowadays is Emily Henry books. Like they're a good example of different happy endings for different kinds of characters.
So can you give us some examples?
So one of the books, Beach Read, you simply know that they're together. They've both achieved their goal of writing a book and they've published it and it's out there and they're together.
Spoilers.
Yeah, sorry, spoilers. Yeah.
Basically, we're academics. Whenever we talk about a book, we'll spoil it.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Book Lovers does have the hint at a betrothal, but it's more about the fact that they've been able to maintain a successful relationship for, a certain period
And
of time.
this
we
is
get a little
probably
epilogue. That's
Yeah,
when books
yeah,
do
the
that.
epilogue,
Yeah.
the epilogue.
Yeah.
where you get to see it all nice and happy. But this is probably the point where we start feeling like we really need a 21st century version of this,
Yeah.
because, of course, now romance novels can have what they call a happy for now.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is so much more, I think it's more gratifying for people if I am going to apply the
Speak for your whole
generational-
generation.
Yeah, I'm going to speak for everyone my age.
Every Gen Z.
Just gonna
in
take
the
this
world.
giant paintbrush.
I think it almost seems like more achievable in a sense. It's more gratifying. It's this idea that you've worked towards a relationship and you've been able to achieve it, and then the epilogue tells you that you're able to maintain it and you can have it.
Do you think also there's an element of you know, of romance to get that affect has to end at what they used to call the highest, happiest point. Do you think there's an element of the fantasy has shifted and that marriage is not necessarily the ideal?
Yeah.
Maybe for some people.
Absolutely. I think that epilogues are like super important to people as well nowadays, and they want to see it past the highest, happiest point. They want to see that it can exist beyond that.
Yeah.
Which I think is super interesting. Well, that's the first time I've really like thought of that.
I think I'll say the other caveat for something like a podcast is it's not a written paper. It's like it's not something you're drafting. So we're just going to talk aloud, and next week you might rethink it. Thinking, I don't know that I feel that. This is like thinking aloud.
Yeah, I agree with that in the moment I said it.
I heard a really good term actually. I can't remember where I heard it now. I'm sorry. But it was first draft thinking. And I like that. I've heard people say it in meetings now. I'm just going to do some first draft thinking.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That's definitely, I almost completely exist in first draft thinking.
So now that we've got them, so we've got state of society, the meeting, the barrier, attraction, declaration, point of ritual death, which is like the bleak moment, recognition of the means to overcome, and betrothal. Or as we might say, happily ever after or happy for now. So it just ends on
happy ending.
Happy ending. The questions we have, and I'd like you two to throw more in, but these are things that I've been thinking about lately, particularly working with a bunch of postgrads in the area, is about how now that we're sitting in the 21st century and we're looking at the genre which has been predominantly Western, white, heterosexual, focused on white women basically. And there's been a really important role for that, I think, as the waves of feminism have happened, but it has excluded a lot of people.
Yeah.
So in this moment, as the full range of humans in all their genders, races, sexualities, physical forms are fighting and seeking equality, and we are keen to recognise equality, what does that mean for the form of the romance novel? And I'm really curious about the structure. So does writing queer romance mean reinforcing a heteronormative relationship?
Yeah.
Thoughts on that? We can explore this over the whole season and next season, but did you have any more questions in that area?
If I'm going to specifically talk about queer romance, when I think about when people talk about it, they do want to see a queer couple go through all the same motions as a heterosexual couple does, and they want it to hit all the same points.
Do you mean when you say they, are we talking about a general kind of heterosexual readership, or?
I think queer people who are reading queer stories, if you will.
I'm curious about
I think we
that.
have to be careful.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have no clue. I mean, all I know is that sometimes I feel horrible at saying that, but there's a frustration with this idea that every queer story has to follow,
the tragic ending.
Yes, that needs to be broken.
Yeah,
yes.
the idea that they are all coming to terms with their sexuality in every story when sometimes they have already come to terms with their sexuality.
I guess I'm curious, just because we do have a few colleagues who are working in this space, I'm really curious about interrogating the structure and really thinking about what does a romantic relationship mean? Like, can it be stretched and be more inclusive of different? I mean, I know there are polyamorous romances, for example.
Yes.
But, we are really talking about a form that has historically emerged as a white heterosexual woman's form of literature.
Yes.
Which has faced, it is as a result, faced a lot of sexism and elision.
I think on one side of it there is an easy answer and a hard answer. And the easy one is, we're problematizing it right now. 3 white women are sitting in a room trying to solve a problem that's not ours.
Or we're posing questions.
Yeah, but you know what I mean when I say that. The easy answer to that is get more people in from these communities in these spaces, and they're there and they're fighting and they're trying and they're not being given the publishing deals and the spaces in the room that they should be being given. And that's not, that's a big complex problem that is institutional and layered. But one easy solution is, if we want to know what it looks like and what it sounds like and what it feels like for marginalised communities to be in love and feel romance, give them the voice and space to let their voices be out there. But then the other side of that coin is, the complexities of if we're still trying to publish and there is a definition that only fits one type of romance, where do they publish? Where do they fit? How does that look? Where does that work? And so I think it does need to be pulled apart further.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm quite interested in that idea of the affect, the feeling, and really, and I agree. Like, I don't think that's our work to do, and I think hopefully in coming episodes we will eventually invite guests on to talk about some of these things.
If you're listening to this and you would like to be part of our podcast and talk to some of these issues, reach out to our Instagram, send us a DM. We would love to talk to you. We would love to give you the space to speak to these issues directly, because whilst it's just us sitting in this room, we're the only people who can. But we would love to open the floor to anybody who is an authority here.
The privilege we have of having this position is posing the questions, because I think this is a genre that has sort of sat unexamined for quite a long time.
Yeah, I think there's too many people that haven't even been bothered to consider that question, to even ask it.
It's good to be, I mean, in our, positions, the fact that we are straight, cis, het women, I think it is better that we are at least questioning it.
We're going to make a lot of mistakes, but I'm curious about...
I feel like I've already made one.
No, you haven't.
It's fine. I think we have to talk messily, and I don't want to speak for people, but what I want to do as a romance writer and a scholar is to think, instead of taking a definition of romance as common sense, as saying this is what romance is, particularly because we have so few definitions, is to complicate it and think, what are the elements that are essential? So Regis is calling these essential elements, but they are blind to questions of privilege.
Yeah. I mean, well, Kathleen and I read a book recently, well, not really recently, and I thought it was a romance. Kathleen,
no!
Did not at all think it was a romance, which I think was interesting. I thought it was maybe like a more like contemporary.
Do you want to just name the book? Because I know the book.
You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty is the book, and I thought it was a romance, or at least one that is maybe adapting to the times. Personally, Kathleen didn't think it was a romance novel because it focused too heavily on the protagonist's internal emotional journey. Is that maybe one of the...
No. I just think... So I'm probably a little bit more comfortable with some of the more traditional elements of romance genre. I still, and as you guys will discover, I'm more than happy to rip apart some of these elements. But I still think there is a basic fundamentalism that we can't escape, and probably because I'm thinking about it a little bit publishy and probably trying to consider the way that industry affects everything. I like paratext, I guess we could say, as being part of the discussion. And I think we can't ignore how people will respond when they pick up and what their expectations are when they read. And for me, that book had a lot of emotional stuff in it, but I didn't find that it hit the affect and emotional uplifting and hopefulness that we've come to expect perhaps from a romance, and maybe even demand from a romance.
But it did for you, Georgia.
Yeah, it did.
Interesting.
I think there was a realism to the book.
Yes.
Well, which, as again, we were going to talk about realistic.
We can do that in the next episode. I've got lots of questions.
I think that it felt representative of maybe how relationships do form in the 21st century. It was, I mean, the main romantic relationship doesn't really start until about halfway through the book, which was
my other issue. I think it hit too late. Like, it felt like a romance really needs to be the central story to be a romance. Otherwise,
you do get more of like the background to the character, if you will, and her relationship with relationships.
It's not even until like almost 60% of the way through that the relationship that is the happy ending is established. So to me, I was like, this is women's fiction.
Yeah. Sometimes I look at it like I think it had a central love story or a central romantic story.
I would say there was a lot of elements.
Yeah.
There was a lot of
and
romantic elements and love story
and
elements.
And it had the happy ending, which are those two big ones.
So what we're going to do in coming weeks is cycle these episodes. I think they can tell I'm starting to wrap up.
Yeah, we've got a lot longer.
We could go on for hours, but we're going to cycle through episodes. We're going to look at every month. We're going to have a look at, first of all, one of Regis's defining points and unpack it. And then we're going to have a look at a subgenre and then a trope of romance. And then we're going to have a little book club and read a book and discuss. So the first book we're going to read, if you'd like to read along with us, is Ali Hazelwood's Love on the Brain. And we're going to call it the Love on Campus Book Club, I think. Yeah. But what you can hear when Georgia and Kathleen are talking is we
get our boxing gloves out.
I know this has always happened. Like readers always have really interesting discussions, and there have always been book clubs, and now we have Book Talk and we have Bookstagram and we have all the different ways that readers engage with ideas, and readers are never going to agree because we're not a monolithic group. Yeah. We're lots of different people.
And that's why having one general structure is so contentious.
But I think it's changing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying about, I know I probably poked the nest, but with queer romance, like to think that you can just plug in a new group. But same with generations. It's not just queerness, it's race, it's class, it's countries, coming from different countries and backgrounds and contexts, and we are not all the same person, and so what we imagine is romantic is going to be completely different. And I think we are noting a generational shift in the way people are, for example, referring to Colleen Hoover as romance. Whereas
that's next episode.
Yeah. So we're going to get into all this.
We don't have the time.
But I think that's been a good taste test. This is our first episode, so we're going to iron out the kinks. But I think it's been fun, personally.
I think so. I feel like I need like all my books with me, and I need to have very extensive notes. Otherwise, I'm never going to sound articulate or say what I want.
You're so great. I feel myself biting my tongue. I'm like, don't talk too much.
But thank you for joining us for the very first episode of Love on Campus, which has been about Regis's 8 essential elements of romance and the question of how we define it, which we're going to continue to discuss in coming weeks. But until then, thanks for joining me, Kathleen.
Thank you for hosting us, Amy.
Thank you for joining us, Georgia.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Kathleen.
And we will see you all next week for Love on Campus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.